Welcome back to Civil Wars. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on the conflict trap. This comes out of a book called Breaking the Conflict Trap, which was a study commissioned by the World Bank. As you might know, the World Bank is interested in helping out developing economies, and they realized that civil war is a huge impediment to that process. So they commissioned this study to figure out what exactly the problem was and come up with some sort of recommendations on how to resolve it. I'm going to be splitting this up into two separate lectures. This first lecture will explain what the problem is, the conflict trap, and the second half will explain how to break out of that conflict trap, those recommendations on how to resolve the problem. Now, the main argument is that civil war is development in reverse. So if you're a developing country, the way you get rid of that status is to invest in productive economic activities, which are going to raise your GDP, and over time your GDP is going to be high enough that you no longer have that developing label, but are rather developed. On the other hand, civil war flips this on its head. You stop producing useful economic industries and you start ramping up your production in war making. And war making, of course, is also destruction. So you're ramping up your production in destruction. And I know I've said that war is costly many times in the past because it kills people, it destroys buildings and whatever. But as it turns out, and as they go into elaborate detail in this book, these costs of war are way worse than you might otherwise think that they are. And this starts with the actual monetary expenditures. So if you look at military expenditures in a developing country from peacetime to wartime, during peacetime you're looking at 2.8% of overall expenditures. And while it's not getting all the way up to double that, it's getting close to double that during wartime. You're going up to 5% of expenditures. And these expenditures don't immediately drop after war. Persistent effects are all over the place in war, and this is just one of them. If you're fighting a war and you come up with a peaceful settlement, you might actually need to keep high military expenditures to ensure that that peace lasts. And so rather than dropping immediately down to 2.8%, you're still seeing heightened military expenditures even after the war ends. Meanwhile, during the war, you're seeing all sorts of destruction, both on the battlefield and off. If you're fighting a war against a side and you want to hurt that side, the way you do that is by destroying telecommunications, destroying roads, destroying bridges, destroying airports, destroying ports. These all have useful military applications, but they're also very important to running an effective economy. So if you have something that is useful and is necessary for an effective economy, it's probably going to be the target of a war. And if it's the target of war, you're losing it. And if you're losing it, well, there goes part of your economy. And that's bad for you, of course. Meanwhile, public health disappears. So forgetting about the front lines for the moment, if you're sitting at home, if you're a civilian, you're going to have higher incidences of disease, less ability to protect yourself from the disease, less ability to obtain an immunization to important diseases, and you're going to have a harder time acquiring food and water. And all of that is going to result in a mortality rate spike, not just, again, for people fighting on the front lines, but also for you as a civilian at home. Your mortality rate is going to go up. And this is going to have some perverse effects on your incentives to invest. If you're more worried about dying, then you have less reason to care about the future. And if you have less reason to care about the future, you have less incentive to invest, right? Because an investment is a delay in economic returns. So rather than enjoying as much as I can right now, I actively hurt my enjoyment today so I can enjoy more tomorrow, which is ultimately great for me if I can actually obtain that wealth in the future. And it's great for my country as well, because this sort of investment is what drives GDP growth. But when I have this less incentive to invest, we're going to see less investment overall in the country, and less investment overall in the country means smaller GDP growth. Again, bad. This all creates a money vacuum as well. So lawlessness in the country is going to increase, and this lawlessness gives you less incentive to keep money at home because you're worried that it might be stolen. And so if you have the ability to ship money abroad, you're going to look into that, perhaps into a safe Swiss bank account or something like that. So if we look at investment in a developing country that's abroad, that goes up from 9% during peacetime to 20% during wartime. So you're seeing a lot of money being shipped out of the country, which is bad for your own personal growth or your own individual country's growth, because you're not investing that money back into the country to grow that country's economy. And again, this effect persists after war. It's not like that you go immediately back down to having 9% of the money invested abroad after the war ends. This effect lingers because you're still worried about lawlessness even after the war ends. And there are also all sorts of other persistent effects. Wars involve landmines oftentimes, and so those landmines are not going to magically disappear once the war ends. That's going to prevent and inhibit travel within your country because you're worried going through a particularly dangerous location that your leg might blow off, and that's something that you obviously do not want. People returning from the front lines are going to be coming home with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. This is something that we're learning more and more about, especially after the Iraq War for the United States. If you've ever known someone with PTSD, PTSD takes otherwise normal individuals and makes them go crazy. It makes these people, you can't even comprehend what these people do. They don't understand what they're doing. It doesn't make sense to them, but they do it anyway. It's a terrible, terrible condition. This also creates a culture of violence, and we have great evidence from this in a really weird location. So this culture of violence persists in someone who is growing up in a country that has a civil war. So imagine that I'm growing up in a country that has a civil war going on inside of it, and I later on in my life move abroad. Perhaps because I am a star soccer player, and I'm able to obtain access and play in a Premier League in Europe. Well, we have a study on this. We have a study of those players who play in Premier Leagues in Europe, and essentially what the study did is it looked at all players and all of their backgrounds and whether they grew up in places that were affected by civil war. So this is actually being inside of a country during a civil war. This isn't necessarily you fighting in the civil war. You're just inside of the country at the time. And then they looked at the persistence or the number of cards that those individuals drew. Soccer cards, of course, are fouls, essentially, that are formally introduced, and these are things that you get for acting overly aggressive or unsportsmanlike. And what this study saw is that controlling for other factors that might confound this, you actually do see individuals who grow up in countries where civil wars go on getting higher instances of cards than other places. That's bad. This is going on with the culture of violence. So a whole bunch of other persistent effects. And overall, if the too long didn't read of this, is that war really kills your economy for the long term. It has all sorts of bad effects. And as it turns out, you can actually quantify that to 2.2% decline of GDP per year. So every war or every year that you're going on in civil war, you're seeing a decline of 2.2% in your GDP. This, of course, means, say, a 5-year war. Imagine that you had a 5-year civil war, which is still kind of short. A 5-year civil war would result in an 11% drop in your GDP. That is a lot of money lost. Now, the reason that this is called the conflict trap is as follows. What I've described to you right now is that war leads to bad economies, for all sorts of reasons that we discussed here. So the more you go into war, the longer you go into war, the worse your economy is. But the trap is that countries with worse economies tend to fight wars more frequently as well. So you can see that this creates this vicious cycle, where if I have a bad economy, I'm more likely to fight a war. If I'm more likely to fight a war, I'm more likely to have a worse economy. If I have a worse economy, I'm even more likely to fight a war. And if I'm even more likely to fight a war, I'm even more and more likely to have a worse economy, and so forth. This creates this vicious cycle for countries that are developing, that have bad economies, that are fighting wars. They're more likely to engage in this behavior again and again and again and again. That's bad. And that's something that the World Bank is very interested in trying to figure out how to resolve. So that is what the conflict trap is. And in the next lecture, I'll explain to you their recommendations on how we can help out the countries that are having this problem break out of this conflict trap and start developing the way we might want them to. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.